On the dawn of April 14, 1941, outside the perimeter of Tobruk in Libya, 17 German tanks were on fire. They are not burning because of an airstrike, not because of a lucky artillery round. They are burning because Australian infantrymen, dug into holes in the desert floor, surrounded on 3 sides, cut off from the rest of the Allied army, refused to move. The attack had started the morning before. Easter Sunday, the 15th Panzer Division, reinforced and fresh, launched a coordinated assault on the western perimeter. Tanks and infantry together. The textbook blitzkrieg combination that had rolled through Poland, France, Greece, and most of North Africa without stopping. The German commander expected to be inside Tobruk by nightfall. His timetable gave the garrison 48 hours before collapse. Instead, something went wrong. The Australian infantrymen in the forward strongpoints did not retreat when the tanks came through. They stayed in their posts and opened fire on the German infantry following behind the armor. Separated from their infantry support, the panzers rolled forward into a trap of anti-tank guns and artillery that had been sighted specifically for this moment. By the time the engagement ended, 17 tanks had been destroyed. The infantry assault had been broken up before it reached the second line of defense. Rommel called off the attack. It was the first time since he had arrived in North Africa that he had called off an attack. He had never needed to before. The question worth asking is how any of this was possible. 6 weeks earlier, the situation in North Africa looked nothing like a defense. It looked like a rout. Go back to the last day of March 1941. Erwin Rommel had been in Libya for exactly 7 weeks. He had arrived in February with 2 German divisions, the 5th Light Division and the 15th Panzer Division, sent by Hitler to prop up an Italian army that was in the process of being destroyed by the British. His orders were to hold the line at El Agheila on the western edge of Cyrenaica. Defensive orders. Wait, consolidate. Do not advance until both German divisions are fully operational. Rommel ignored them. On March 31st, he launched a probing attack that he turned into a full offensive the moment he saw the British were not holding. What followed was one of the fastest advances in the history of armored warfare. In 11 days, Rommel's forces covered more than 1,000 kilometers of desert. They took Benghazi. They took Derna. They drove east along the Libyan coast at a speed the British could not match and could barely track. Entire British units were cut off, captured, or scattered. 2 British generals, including the commander of the Cyrenaica garrison, were taken prisoner when their aircraft was forced down behind German lines. By April 11th, German armor had reached the Egyptian frontier. The whole of Cyrenaica, the eastern bulge of Libya that British forces had spent months capturing from the Italians, was gone in less than a fortnight. The British commander in Cairo, General Archibald Wavell, looked at his maps and said out loud what they showed. There was nothing between Rommel and Cairo, nothing except one place, one port, one garrison that had not retreated with the rest. Tobruk. The port of Tobruk sits on the Libyan coast, carved into a natural deep-water harbor that can supply an army. That was the point. Whoever controlled Tobruk controlled the only viable port between Tripoli and Alexandria. Tripoli was 1,500 kilometers to the west. Alexandria was 500 kilometers to the east. If Rommel wanted to advance into Egypt, which he did, he needed fuel, ammunition, and supplies closer than Tripoli. He needed Tobruk. Wavell understood this before Rommel's offensive had even finished. His order went out while British forces were still retreating. Hold Tobruk. Do not give it up under any circumstances. The garrison that received that order was built around the 9th Australian Division, commanded by Major General Leslie Morshead. The 9th was not a veteran formation. It had been in Palestine, training when Rommel's offensive began. It was rushed to Tobruk in the last days of March as the British line collapsed, moving through Derna and along the coastal road with German forces closing on them from the south. They had insufficient artillery. Several of their battalions were short of men. Their anti-tank capacity was inadequate for the size of the perimeter they were being asked to hold. Morshead was told to hold a defensive perimeter of roughly 48 kilometers, a semicircle of fortified posts running from the coast west of the harbor, arcing south and east through the desert and returning to the coast to the east. The Italians had begun building this perimeter before losing Tobruk to the British in January. There was an anti-tank ditch, incomplete, and in places camouflaged with boards and sand. There were strong points in a zigzag pattern along the red line, the forward defensive position, with a second line, the blue line, 3 miles behind it. The whole system depended on the strong points holding. If the line broke and was not immediately reinforced, the port was open. On April 11th, the last land route out of Tobruk was cut. German forces reached the coast to the east and completed the encirclement. From that point, the only way in or out was by sea, under air attack at night. The garrison was surrounded by the most effective armored force in the world, commanded by a general who had not yet lost a battle he had chosen to fight. Wavell sent a message to Morshead's headquarters. It contained the assessment he had already given to his own staff. There was nothing behind Tobruk. If the garrison did not hold, Rommel had a clear road to the Suez Canal, the artery through which Britain supplied its entire war effort in the east. Lose the canal, and Britain's position in the Middle East, Africa, and the Indian Ocean became untenable. The arithmetic was that stark. Morshead read it. He passed his own order to the garrison. There would be no surrender. There would be no retreat. Rommel expected to be done quickly. After his April 11th encirclement, he sent forces forward to probe the perimeter and scheduled a full assault for Easter. His intelligence told him the garrison was disorganized, undersupplied, and holding a line that was too long for its numbers. All of this was largely true. What his intelligence did not tell him was what Morshead had already decided to do with those numbers. The Easter Battle, April 13th and 14th, was the result. 2 days of Panzer assault against Australian infantry holding fortified posts in rocky desert ground. The tanks came through in places. They were supposed to, according to Morshead's plan. The forward posts were not meant to stop tanks. They were meant to stop the infantry behind them. Without infantry support, the German tanks were exposed to the anti-tank guns and 25-pounders positioned in depth. Several Panzers that penetrated the red line were destroyed from behind. The infantry assault lost cohesion under fire from the flanks. By Easter Monday afternoon, the attack had failed. 17 tanks burning in the sand. German infantry withdrawing across open ground in daylight. It was the first check the Africa Corps had received since Rommel had taken command. Within days, a radio broadcast reached the garrison from a Nazi propaganda station transmitting in English. The broadcaster was William Joyce, known by his on-air name Lord Haw Haw, an Irish-American who had chosen the German side and whose contemptuous announcements were monitored by Allied troops across the theater. His message about Tobruk was short. The garrison, he said, was caught like rats in a trap, surrounded, cut off, waiting for a relief that would not come in time. The Australians heard it, they discussed it, and then they kept the name, not as an insult, as a statement of intent. The Germans called them rats. The Australians kept the name. What they did with it is a different story entirely. By the spring of 1941, Erwin Rommel had been at war for nearly 2 years and had not yet lost a battle he chose to fight. His record before North Africa was already enough to make him one of the most watched officers in the German army. In the First World War, he had led a small mountain infantry unit at Caporetto in 1917, capturing 9,000 Italian soldiers and 81 guns with a force of 600 men in under 2 days. Between the wars, he wrote a tactical manual, Infantry Attacks, that became required reading at military academies, including West Point. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, Rommel commanded the 7th Panzer Division and drove it so fast and so far ahead of the rest of the German line that his own headquarters repeatedly lost contact with him. His division became known as the Ghost Division. It covered 240 kilometers in a single day. It crossed the Meuse, drove through the Argonne, and reached the French coast at Cherbourg before the campaign ended. In 6 weeks, France was finished. Hitler sent him to Africa in February 1941 with specific instructions to hold a defensive line. Rommel looked at the ground, looked at the British dispositions, and decided to attack instead. By April 11th, as already established, he had his encirclement. He had every reason to believe Tobruk would go the same way as everything else. He was familiar with the formula: armor forward, infantry through the gap. Psychological shock ahead of the physical blow. Blitzkrieg was not simply a tactic, it was a system that fed on momentum. Every success made the next success easier because defenders stopped trusting their own positions, stopped believing they could hold, and began looking for a way out before the tanks arrived. The moment an army started retreating, Rommel accelerated until the retreat became a collapse. He had done it in France. He had done it in Libya 3 weeks earlier, chasing British forces 1,000 kilometers east in 11 days. He looked at Tobruk and saw no reason it would be different. He had a detailed study of the Italian fortifications. He had armor. He had momentum. He scheduled the assault for Easter weekend and told his staff the port would be in German hands within 48 hours. He had not yet met Leslie Morshead. In appearance, Morshead was easy to underestimate. He was born in 1889 in Ballarat, Victoria, the 6th of 7 children. His father died when Leslie was 6, leaving the family in financial difficulty. He attended the local school, took a teaching qualification, and spent the years before the First World War working as a schoolteacher in New South Wales. He enlisted as a private in 1914 and served on Gallipoli and in France, rising through the ranks on the strength of what his superiors consistently described as coolness under pressure and an instinct for organization. By the end of that war, he was a lieutenant colonel. Between the wars, he ran a successful shipping business in Sydney, stayed active in the part-time militia, and commanded battalions and brigades without the salary of a full-time soldier. In 1941, when he took command of the 9th Australian Division, he was 51 years old, slightly built. His face in photographs appears mild at first glance. It was not mild. His speech was precise and direct, and people who worked with him long enough came to understand that the mild expression was a surface characteristic with nothing underneath it to soften a decision he had already made. The 9th Division's men gave him the nickname Ming the Merciless, after the villain in the Flash Gordon comic strips. Because he had a habit of squinting and slowly stroking his chin when he was thinking through a problem, which bore an unfortunate resemblance to how the artists drew Ming when he was devising something unpleasant. The nickname was also, in the understated manner of Australian soldiers, an acknowledgement of something real. Crossing Morshead had consequences. He enforced discipline with the kind of consistency that made his orders credible in both directions. The men trusted the orders because they had learned the orders would be followed through. He was not a flashy commander. He gave no speeches recorded for posterity. He issued instructions and expected them to be executed. The instruction that defined Tobruk was simple in form and radical in implication. There would be no surrender. There would be no retreat. No man's land would become their land. To understand what that order meant in practice, it helps to understand the ground Morshead was working with. The Tobruk perimeter was roughly 48 kilometers long, running in a semicircle from the coast west of the harbor, arcing south through the desert and returning east to the coast. The Italians had built the basic defensive infrastructure before they lost the port to the British in January. A system of concrete strongpoints known as posts, arranged in a forward line called the Red Line, with a second position, the blue line, running 3 miles behind it. Between the two lines, anti-tank. Mines were laid to slow armored penetrations. A third position, the green line, sat 2 to 4 miles outside the town itself, the last resort. The forward posts on the red line were roughly 750 yards apart, with a second row staggered 500 yards behind the first in a zigzag pattern designed so that any attacker who broke through one post was immediately exposed to fire from the posts on either side. The anti-tank ditch was incomplete when the 9th Division arrived. In places, it had been covered with boards and a thin layer of sand to conceal it. The garrison spent the first weeks of the siege improving it, digging it deeper, extending it, laying more mines. The artillery was a mix of 48 25-pounders, 12 18-pounders, and 12 4.5-inch howitzers. These were positioned not only to support the infantry, but to operate in the anti-tank role, because the garrison's dedicated anti-tank capacity was insufficient for the size of the perimeter, and Morshead needed every gun pulling double duty. A mobile reserve of tanks, artillery, and anti-tank guns was held back from the forward line, specifically to plug breaches when they appeared. All of this was standard defensive thinking. The part that was not standard was the patrol order. Morshead's directive was explicit. Deep reconnaissance patrols would go out every night across the entire perimeter. Fighting patrols would raid enemy positions, take prisoners for intelligence, destroy German and Italian forward posts, cut wire, remove mines, disrupt attack preparations, and return before dawn. The purpose was not merely to gather information, it was to make the Germans and Italians afraid of the dark. Every night the enemy spent watching for Australian patrols beyond their wire was a night they were not preparing the next assault. Every prisoner taken was intelligence. Every German Sangar destroyed was one less prepared firing position. Every supply dump raided, and the Australians raided German supply dumps when their own rations ran short, was a reminder that the besieged force had not accepted the conditions of a siege. Morshead's own description of what he intended was precise. Tobruk, he said, was not a siege, it was not a defense. It was a permanent offensive, day after day, night after night. The implications of that philosophy took months to work their full effect on the German and Italian forces surrounding the port, but the shape of it was visible from the beginning. Axis propagandists attempting to mock the garrison's commander after months of being raided and harassed and denied sleep settled on a nickname of their own. They called him Ali Baba Morshead and his 20,000 thieves. They meant it as contempt. The garrison took it as confirmation. The man the German army was facing was not a general waiting to be relieved. He was a schoolteacher from Ballarat who had decided on behalf of 35,000 men that the besiegers were going to become the besieged. What that looked like from the inside, shocked from the bottom of a fortified hole in the Libyan desert under artillery fire and Stuka attack, rationed to 1 pint of water a day, is the next part of this story. There is a particular quality to the desert at midday in the Libyan summer that soldiers who survived Tobruk described for the rest of their lives. The heat does not arrive gradually. By 10 in the morning, it is already past 35 degrees. By noon, it sits at 40 and above. The desert floor radiates it back upward, so the air between the ground and a man's face becomes a column of trapped warmth that has nowhere to go. There is no shade inside a fortified post. There is rock, sand, corrugated iron, and the sun. Men who needed to move between positions during daylight hours moved fast and low and hoped the German observers on the high ground to the south were looking somewhere else. Often they were not. The artillery response to movement in the open was rarely more than a few minutes behind the movement itself. So most of the men didn't move during daylight. They stayed in their posts. They waited for dark. This was life in Tobruk for 242 days. The water allocation was 1 pint per man per day. A single pint roughly 570 milliliters, for drinking and washing combined, in 40-degree heat, doing physical work under constant stress. The body requires several liters of water per day under those conditions just to maintain basic function. What the garrison received was a fraction of that, and the fraction did not change regardless of the temperature or the operational tempo. The food was bully beef and hardtack biscuits primarily, canned meat that had been sitting in desert heat long enough to test the limits of its preservation. The biscuits were hard enough to crack teeth. Fresh food arrived intermittently by sea and disappeared quickly. Vitamin deficiencies became a medical problem within weeks. Dysentery spread through the garrison with the methodical efficiency of a disease that had exactly the conditions it needed: men living close together in the ground, water scarce, sanitation improvised. By the middle of the siege, medical officers were tracking not just battle casualties, but the steady degradation of the garrison's physical condition as a military variable. Men who were not wounded were still weakening. The flies were everywhere. They arrived with the heat and did not leave. They covered food the moment it was exposed. They settled on wounds. They moved between the latrines and the ration packs with complete indifference to the attempts to stop them. Lice were a constant. Men who had grown up in Australian cities and towns found themselves conducting daily searches of their clothing as a routine act, the same way they checked their weapons. Scorpions were a secondary hazard, nocturnal, present in the rock and sand, and capable of ending a man's effectiveness for days. The Stuka dive bombers came in waves, primarily targeting the harbor and the fuel and ammunition dumps. The Junkers Ju 87 made a distinctive sound when it dived, a mechanical wail generated by the sirens fitted to its landing gear, designed specifically to add psychological effect to the physical danger. Men who had been under Stuka attack described the sound as something that did not become routine, no matter how many times they heard it. The harbor was hit repeatedly. Buildings in the town were reduced to rubble over weeks and months. The garrison learned to use the rubble as cover and lived in the spaces underneath it. The artillery never stopped for long. German and Italian guns shelled the perimeter, the harbor, the supply routes, and any movement they could identify. Movement across open ground during daylight was a calculation, distance, cover, the current weight of fire, that soldiers made quickly and got right or did not get to make again. Corporal Jeffrey Lowe of the 212th Battalion summarized it plainly. You couldn't move in daytime. You'd be shot. So the garrison lived underground and waited for dark when the arithmetic changed. The only supply line into Tobruk ran by sea at night under Luftwaffe air cover that did not stop because the sun went down. The ships that made this run were known, collectively, as the Tobruk Ferry. The Royal Australian Navy contribution to the ferry was a group of destroyers so old and worn that the German propaganda machine had already given them a dismissive name, the Scrap Iron Flotilla. The Australians accepted the name with the same reflex they had applied to the Rats. HMAS Stuart, Voyager, Vampire, Vendetta, Waterhen, Napier, Nizam, Parramatta. These ships ran into Tobruk Harbor after dark, unloaded food, ammunition, water, and replacement troops as fast as the wharves could handle them, loaded the wounded and the men being rotated out, and ran back to Alexandria before the light came up. Every run was made under the threat of air attack. The Luftwaffe used moonlit nights, searchlights, and a standing commitment to sinking anything that moved in the harbor to make the ferry as costly as possible. They succeeded, partially. HMAS Waterhen was sunk on June 30, 1941, the first RAN vessel lost in the Second World War. HMAS Parramatta was torpedoed and sunk on November 27, 1941, with the loss of most of her crew. 21 smaller vessels were sunk across the duration. The men who crewed the ships that kept running knew the count. They ran the route anyway, because without the ferry the garrison could not hold, and without the garrison, the road to Cairo was open. Inside the perimeter, the men in the posts knew the ships were coming because they could sometimes hear the anti-aircraft fire from the harbor during the night. They did not always know the cost. The cost was paid out of their sight, in the water. And then, after dark, the garrison went to work. Moorehead's patrol order was not theoretical. Every night, across every sector of the 48-kilometer perimeter, groups of Australian infantry went out beyond the wire into no man's land. The patrols ranged in size from small reconnaissance teams of 8 to 10 men to fighting patrols of 30 or more. Their objectives were specific and varied. Locate German and Italian forward positions, identify any preparations for attack, cut wire, lift mines, or lay them in new positions. Destroy enemy listening posts and observation posts. The sangars, stone-built shelters that German and Italian soldiers constructed in the rocky ground. Take prisoners, and when the opportunity presented itself, raid supply dumps. The patrol reports from June and July 1941 record this work in the flat language of military documentation. Patrol departed 2,200 hours, contacted enemy position at grid reference, engaged. Enemy casualties estimated at 5, 2 prisoners taken. Own casualties 1 wounded. Returned 3:30 hours, night after night, across hundreds of patrols. The cumulative effect was not glamorous. It was attrition applied in the dark. In July 1941 alone, the garrison's patrols killed 180 Axis soldiers, wounded 230, and captured 11 prisoners. Over the full course of the siege, approximately 1,700 Axis prisoners were taken by the garrison. Each one represented an intelligence source, a disruption to enemy plans, and a small psychological message sent to every German and Italian soldier watching the wire, that the dark outside the perimeter belonged to the Australians. At some point during the siege, the precise date is not recorded, men of the garrison collected the wreckage of a German aircraft that had been shot down near the perimeter. From its scrap metal, they cut and shaped their own medals. The design was a rat. They made them by hand from the remains of an enemy machine, and they wore them. No authority ordered those medals made. No regulation covered them. They were made because the men who made them had decided, without needing to discuss it at length, exactly what they were and what they had done and what they thought of the name the Germans had given them. Rommel did not intend to wait them out. He had tried twice to break the perimeter and failed. In May 1941, he came back with his heaviest force yet. The German army in 1941 did not lose set-piece armored assaults. That is not an exaggeration made in retrospect. It is the operational record. From September 1939 through the spring of 1941, wherever German armor had been committed in a coordinated attack against a prepared position, it had broken through. Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Greece. The formula worked because it depended on a specific sequence. Tanks penetrate the forward line. Infantry pour through the gap. The defense loses cohesion and begins to withdraw. The withdrawal accelerates into collapse. The psychological component was as important as the mechanical one. Blitzkrieg was a system that required defenders to behave in a predictable way. It required them to retreat. At Tobruk, the Australians declined to do that. The consequences of that refusal, played out across 3 separate German attempts over the course of 2 months, form the clearest military argument for what the garrison achieved and why it mattered beyond the port itself. The Easter Battle, April 13th and 14th, 1941, was Rommel's first serious assault on the perimeter, and he committed substantial force to it. The attack on the night of April 13th came from the southwest, with German infantry probing the wire around Strong Point R33 on the Red Line. Several hundred infantry broke through the wire in the early hours and spread into the ground beyond. By first light on Easter Sunday, they had established a foothold. Then the tanks came. Easter Monday, April 14th. Rommel sent his armor through the breach created the night before. The plan followed the standard template: tanks forward, infantry through the gap, exploit the penetration, drive north toward the harbor. The 15th Panzer Division's tank strength rolled through the broken section of the Red Line and continued north. And then the tanks were alone. The Australian infantry in the strongpoints flanking the breach had not retreated. They had stayed in their posts, as ordered, and when the German infantry tried to follow the tanks through the gap, they walked into fire from both sides. The infantry assault broke apart before it could consolidate. The tanks ahead of them pressed on and found themselves moving through a defensive system that had been designed specifically for this situation. 25-pounders and anti-tank guns positioned in depth, sighted to engage armor that had separated from its infantry support. The mobile reserve Mooreshead had held back from the AO forward line moved to cut off the German armor from behind. By the afternoon of April 14th, 17 German tanks had been destroyed. The penetration was contained. Rommel ordered the assault stopped. In his own account of the battle, written that evening, Rommel noted that the attack had failed because the Australian infantry would not leave their positions. This was not a minor tactical observation. It was an acknowledgment that the fundamental premise of the assault, that defenders would behave as defenders had behaved everywhere else, was wrong. Rommel regrouped and prepared a second attempt. The Battle of the Salient, which developed through late April and into May 1941, was a different kind of assault. Rommel shifted his axis of attack to the western sector, focusing on the high ground at Ras el Medwar, a feature that dominated the surrounding desert and gave whoever held it a significant observation advantage over the perimeter. On April 30th, he committed the full strength of the 15th Panzer Division, fresh from Germany at full establishment, equipped with the latest tanks, in a coordinated attack that also included the Italian Ariete Armored Division on the flank. This time, the Germans made ground. The attack on April 30th broke through the Red Line on a front of roughly 2 kilometers and pushed several kilometers into the perimeter before Australian resistance stiffened. By May 1st, German and Italian forces held a wedge of territory centered on Ras el Medwar, a protrusion into the Allied line that became known as the Salient. General Friedrich Paulus, who had been sent by the German High Command specifically to assess Rommel's operations and had arrived in time for the assault, concluded by the end of May 2 that the attack had reached its limit. The most advanced German troops were isolated, exhausted, and unable to dig into the rocky ground quickly enough to consolidate. The attack had no reserves left to exploit any further. Gains. Paulus ordered the offensive halted. The salient remained, a permanent German foothold inside the perimeter that would require Australian counterattacks for weeks to contain. The fighting in and around it was some of the worst of the entire siege. Men of the 248th Battalion attacked Ras el Medwar on the night of May 3rd and were repulsed with heavy casualties. They attacked again. They were repulsed again. Mooreshead refused to accept the German gains as permanent, and his refusal was not without cost. The counterattacks into the salient through May and June were attritional operations in ground where the distance between opposing positions was sometimes measured in hundreds of meters, in some places less. But the result was that the German wedge did not expand. It was held at its boundaries, counterattacked repeatedly, and denied the observation advantage that Rommel had intended it to provide. The salient became a fixed point that consumed German attention and resources, without delivering the breakthrough that had justified taking it. Rommel had made ground. He had not broken the garrison. By June 1941, there was a third calculation to consider. The garrison had been told in late April that relief was approximately 8 weeks away. A British offensive was being prepared in Egypt, a substantial armored operation that would drive west along the coast, break the encirclement from the outside, and end the siege. The garrison held on with that timetable in mind. Operation Battleaxe launched on June 15, 1941. It lasted 3 days. The British armored force ran into German anti-tank screens that Rommel had established on the Egyptian frontier and was decisively defeated. By June 17th, the operation had failed, the armored force had withdrawn, and the siege of Tobruk would not be relieved on any timetable that anyone could currently provide. Morshead was informed. He absorbed the information and issued his assessment to his staff. The siege would now last indefinitely. The garrison had to prepare accordingly. His response to that assessment has been recorded in the operational documents of the 9th Division. Morshead identified idleness as the primary threat to the garrison's cohesion. Not the German guns, not the heat, not the deteriorating rations, but the psychological weight of waiting with no defined end point. His solution was the same solution he had applied from the beginning: intensified. The patrol program was accelerated. More men going out more often, into more of no man's land, doing more damage to the Axis positions surrounding the perimeter. The reasoning was both tactical and psychological. Every patrol was an operation with an objective. Every objective achieved was evidence to the men who achieved it that they were not waiting to be rescued. They were fighting an ongoing campaign that they were, by any honest measure, winning at night. The German assessment of Tobruk by the summer of 1941 reflected this reality. Officers of the Africa Corps submitted reports to the German High Command, noting that the Australian garrison dominated no man's land after dark, that forward positions could not be secured against raiding, that the psychological effect on German and Italian troops of constant night harassment was measurable in deteriorating performance. The Axis forces surrounding Tobruk were, in certain operational respects, behaving more like a besieged force than the garrison they were encircling. German High Command reached a conclusion that Rommel found difficult to accept. Tobruk could not be taken with the forces currently allocated to the task. A full-scale siege operation with dedicated engineering assets and sustained air superiority would be required. Resources that were committed elsewhere and could not be freed. Rommel did not abandon the idea of taking Tobruk. He never did. But he did not attempt a third major ground assault in 1941. The port remained in Allied hands for the rest of the year, its garrison patrolling, raiding, enduring, and denying him the one thing he needed most. By October 1941, most of the Australians were pulled out of Tobruk by sea, replaced by British and Polish troops. The siege wasn't over. But what they had proved in 242 days of desert heat, German steel, and no man's land darkness had already changed the war. December 10, 1941. 8 months after the encirclement began, the siege of Tobruk was over. Operation Crusader, the British offensive that had launched on November 18th, had fought its way west across the desert through 3 weeks of fluid, brutal armored engagement. On December 10th, the leading elements of the advancing Eighth Army linked up with a breakout force from the garrison at Ed Duda, southeast of the town. The landward routes into Tobruk were open for the first time since April 11th. The encirclement that Lord Haw Haw had called a trap had lasted 242 days. The relief was not a triumphant entry. There was no ceremony on the day. The men who had held the perimeter were, by any medical assessment, in poor physical condition. 8 months of rationed water, inadequate food, heat, disease, and sustained combat had done what sustained combat and inadequate supply always do to a human body. The 9th Australian Division's medical officers had been documenting the deterioration for months. Morshead himself had written to his superiors in August, acknowledging that the physical condition of his men was declining to the point where it affected operational effectiveness. The relief was not a moment of triumph so much as a moment when the requirement finally ended. The men who walked out of Tobruk that December were thinner than they had gone in. Most of them had been sick at some point. All of them had been under fire repeatedly for the better part of a year. They had held. The casualty figures for the 9th Australian Division and its attached troops counted from the beginning of March through the end of December 1941 were 832 killed, 2,177 wounded, and 941 taken prisoner. These numbers cover the full campaign period, including operations before and after the siege itself. The Australian casualties specifically from the period of the siege, April 8th to October 25th, were 749 killed, 1,996 wounded, and 604 taken prisoner. The Polish Carpathian Brigade, the British units, and the other Allied troops who served in the garrison contributed their own dead to the total. The Tobruk War Cemetery holds them. Those numbers represent the human cost. The strategic accounting is a separate calculation, and it runs in a different direction. For 242 days, Rommel was denied the port of Tobruk. This was not a symbolic deprivation. It was a logistical stranglehold applied to an army that ran on fuel, ammunition, and the ability to move both forward quickly. Without Tobruk, Rommel's supply line ran from Tripoli, 1,500 kilometers to the west along the Via Balbia coastal road, exposed to air attack, subject to flooding, subject to the mechanical wear that desert roads imposed on every vehicle that used them. The road could carry a limited tonnage. Every kilometer of that supply line beyond what was necessary cost Rommel operational capacity he could not recover. More significantly, for the entire summer and autumn of 1941, Rommel was required to keep a substantial portion of his army tied to the Tobruk perimeter. These were not reserve formations sitting idle in Tripoli. These were front-line units, infantry, artillery, engineering assets that could not be used on the Egyptian frontier because they were committed to containing a garrison that would not be contained. Every week the siege continued was a week those forces were unavailable for the advance that Rommel needed to make if he was going to reach the Suez Canal before British strength in Egypt grew beyond what he could overcome. It grew. Because Tobruk held, it grew. The strategic argument is not complicated. Tobruk did not win the North African campaign. It did not destroy the Africa Corps. What it did was buy time, measurable, documented time, during which the British built up the force in Egypt that would eventually stop Rommel at El Alamein. The connection between the 242 days in the desert and the outcome at Alamein in October 1942 is not a straight line, but it is a real one. There is also a tactical legacy that outlasted the siege itself. Before Tobruk, the dominant assumption in Allied military thinking, based on the evidence of 2 years of German armored operations, was that blitzkrieg could not be stopped by infantry in fixed positions. The combination of tanks, speed, and psychological shock had proven in Poland, France, and across Libya that defenders who held their ground against armor were simply destroyed in place, and defenders who knew this retreated before the tanks arrived. The system fed on that knowledge. Mooreshead's garrison broke the EID assumption, not by finding a clever tactical solution and applying it once, by applying a specific set of principles: defense in depth, aggressive patrolling, refusal to yield ground, mobile anti-tank reserves, consistently at scale for 8 months against an opponent who kept looking for the weakness that would make the system collapse. The weakness was never found because Mooreshead had built the system around the one variable he could actually control: the decision, renewed every day by every man in every post, not to stop. The lessons documented from the Tobruk experience, the patrol tactics, the anti-tank dispositions, the use of artillery in depth, the principle that besiegers could be made to behave like the besieged, were taken up by the British War Office and incorporated into doctrine. What had been improvised in the desert by an underprepared division became instruction for armies that came after. Mooreshead himself went on to command the 9th Division at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, where his division held a critical sector and launched the counterattacks that General Montgomery later described as essential to breaking the Axis line. The division that had learned to fight at Tobruk fought at Alamein. The connection was direct. One unit among the Tobruk garrison was present for the entire 242 days. The 2nd 13 Battalion could not be evacuated when the rest of the 9th Division was pulled out by sea between August and October 1941. The ships could not take everyone. The 2nd 13 stayed. When the siege lifted on December 10th, they were still inside the perimeter, the only Australian unit that had been there from the first day of encirclement to the last. They had not been relieved. They had not been rotated out. They had held their section of the line for the full duration, through the Easter Battle, through the salient fighting, through the failure of battle axe, through the months when no relief was coming, and no timetable existed. They walked out with the garrison in December, into an Egypt that was preparing for the next phase of a war that had not paused to acknowledge what they had done. In 1944, the veterans of the Tobruk garrison established the Rats of Tobruk Association. Branches formed across Australia in the years after the war: New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia. Men who had lived in the ground together, patrolled together, rationed water together, wanted to maintain what that experience had made between them. The association held reunions, supported members in hardship, maintained records, and kept the name that Lord Haw Haw had given them as a taunt, and that they had kept as a fact. In the 1950s, the Victorian branch had 1,800 members. They purchased a meeting hall in inner-city Melbourne, Tobruk House, and used it for decades as a gathering place for men who shared something that did not require explanation between them. By 2007, there were 80 members left. All of them were in their 80s and 90s. The 80 men still standing looked at Tobruk House and made a decision about what to do with what remained. They sold the hall. The money, up to $1.5 million Australian dollars, went to the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, where a neuroscience ward had already been named after them. The ward is still there. It carries their name. The Rats of Tobruk ward treats children with neurological conditions in a hospital in a city most of the men who gave it that name never expected to see again after 1941. They did not make a ceremony of it. There is no record of speeches. The 80 men who made the decision were the last of something, and they knew it, and what they chose to do with the last of it was direct the money toward children who needed it. Most people who know Rommel's name do not know Mooresheads. Most people who know the Desert Fox do not know the former schoolteacher from Ballarat, who stopped him first, held him for 242 days, and went back to his business career when it was done. That is not an injustice requiring correction. It is simply the record sitting in the archives of the Australian War Memorial, in the patrol reports and the casualty lists and the medical logs and the operational orders of the 9th Division. A siege is not won by weapons alone. It is not won by numbers or by technology or by the reputation of the force conducting it. It is won by the decision made every morning by every man who woke up inside the wire to do it again today. For 242 days they made that decision. That is what the Rats left behind.